Our panel today is moderated by Dr. Scott Higgins, who brings extensive experience and diverse skills to his position as Senior Research Scientist at the IISD Experimental Lakes Area, or ELA, which is a whole ecosystem research program in northwestern Ontario focused on finding solutions to water quality problems. IISD ELA conducts the foundational research on phosphorus and algal blooms that guides LWF's work and the sampling activities of LWCBMN. And Scott is one of the researchers who regularly doses phosphorus to those lakes as part of the decades-long studies on eutrophication. He's also the author of dozens of papers on nutrient dynamics and freshwater systems. Prior to joining IISD, Scott worked for Fisheries and Oceans Canada as a research scientist with interests in algal ecology, primary production, climate change, and the effects of invasive species. So thanks, Scott, for moderating for us today. At the other end of our panel, there is Mike Stainton. Mike Stainton is a research chemist with Fisheries and Oceans Canada at the Experimental Lakes Area and the Freshwater Institute for 4 decades. He contributed to the foundational research on nutrient dynamics at ELA. He started when the facility first opened in 1968, and he was responsible for designing the aquatic chemistry methods that underpin ELA's long-term experiments and monitoring. Mike also has a strong commitment to public engagement, watershed science, and governance, and he dedicated 2 decades to the Lake Winnipeg Research Consortium, and he also spent a decade on LWF's board. He was also involved with the Community-Based Monitoring Network from the start, supporting the lab analysis, protocol development, and application of our data. Besides Scott is Dr. Nora Casson. She's a professor and Canada Research Chair in Environmental Influences on Water Quality at the University of Winnipeg. Work in her research group focuses on how human activities on the landscape affect water and nutrient cycling and what the implications are for lakes, streams, and wetlands. She's worked with LWF for a number of years now, supporting the collection and analysis of the community-based monitoring network samples, which Carl undertakes in her lab. And she collaborates with us on research projects aimed at reducing snowmelt phosphorus runoff in hotspots identified by the network. And our final panelist is Dr. Henry Wilson, a research scientist with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, based out of the Brandon Research Centre. His research focuses on increasing agricultural resilience while also providing clean water and maintaining productive soils. And his research is unique because it's tailored to what's happening here in Manitoba, where we have unique hydrological and landscape conditions, and significant snowmelt has a big impact on phosphorus dynamics. Henry's background is in agriculture, physical geography, watershed ecology, and biogeochemistry, and he works across disciplines to address complex issues like eutrophication. So this is an incredible panel. This is an incredible set of both scientific expertise and commitment to improved governance and public participation in water stewardship. So we're honored to have you with us today. Thank you very much. Does this go? Okay. This is the second microphone for your panelists.
Okay, thanks Alexis. I'm not sure if this is on yet or not. Check. Can you guys hear me? You can hear me, okay, great. Okay, thanks Alexis, and thanks to our panelists here. It's really exciting and humbling for me to share the stage with these really eminent group of scientists who know so much about Lake Winnipeg and the basin. And I also think it's 10 years of the monitoring network. This is a huge milestone, and it's a great opportunity to reflect on what we've learned over the past 10 years and then what the future looks like as well. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion that we're about to have. And there's going to be, I'm going to ask some questions of the panelists, and there's going to be a chance for audience members to ask questions as well. So maybe we can just jump right in. And my first questions are going to be to Dr. Mike Staton, and they're about the origins of the monitoring network. So, Mike, Dr. Staton, 10 years ago, 10 field seasons ago, the monitoring network was just an idea. So what gaps existed before the network began, and what did the monitoring landscape look like at that time?
Can you hear me without using the microphone? Is that, you're good? Okay. The sound system makes things very echoey.
Oh, Mike, we need the mic for the people at home.
Okay. I tried. Now, first of all, thanks for the honorary degree. I am not a doctor. I know how much hard work goes into getting a PhD, and I never did that, so, but thanks. I guess 10 years ago. I guess 10 years ago we were at a point when it was recognized there were concerns about the health of Lake Winnipeg, and things were starting to be done about addressing the problem. The problem was, I don't know, for almost the first decade, all the funds that were directed towards doing anything about changing the conditions of Lake Winnipeg were sprinkled over the entire watershed. We wasted a decade spending money and effort in parts of the watershed that were irrelevant in terms of nutrient issues in Lake Winnipeg. Putting fences around cattle ponds in the foothills of the Rockies and things like that. On the local scene, the monitoring landscape was a calendar-driven event. I think 4 times a year, samples were taken at some locations in the watershed. They weren't event-driven, so it was a lottery as to whether or not the sample was taken at the time of peak phosphorus loading. So it was not a very it was not a very reliable estimate of what the loading was coming off of various watersheds. Fortunately, Greg, hi Greg, hope you're enjoying this. Fortunately, Greg and I had a personal interest in monitoring in detail the La Salle River watershed. It's a watershed where I live, and we were curious as to where in the watershed the nutrients were coming from, what time of year. So we essentially did what the monitoring program does now, is monitored in great detail over a couple of seasons, making sure we caught the maximum peaks whenever there was in the spring runoff or any events that took place. It was really easy to do. We were interested. We could go out and get samples at timely fashion where we lived. And phosphorus is probably the cheapest and easiest to do analysis that you can find in the suite of analyses that labs do. So it was easy to accomplish. So, great idea. We both had relations with the Lake Winnipeg Foundation, approached about turning this into a citizens monitoring program. A great idea. The world is full of fabulous ideas, but they don't have people like Chelsea to make it a reality. It's just staggering, absolutely staggering, the extent to which a person's management efforts have turned an idea into something that's, look at the number of data points on the provincial map now. It's quite extraordinary. So it was not a very effective way of monitoring. Sorry? Oh, sorry. There was not a very effective way of monitoring where the phosphorus was coming from in the watershed. We had reasons to suspect where it might be. The network was established. It was managed to perfection, and now we have what you've seen presented here, 10 years of highly detailed data about phosphorus loading and where we should focus our attention.
Okay, Mike, that was a really great answer, and I think you've spoken a bit to the limitations that existed before the network existed. Can you speak at all to some of the challenges in estimating phosphorus loads and how the network addresses those challenges?
It's in the detail, both spatial and temporal detail, in terms of identifying where, with limited resources, and if you're interested in changing what people are doing, I guess it's important to know the areas that matter where you're trying to change what people are doing in terms of affecting nutrient runoff in the watershed. So it's just the details.
Yeah, and I think, from my understanding, when the program was developed, one of the important aspects was linking up the sampling locations with water quantity stations, right?
Well, yeah, you know, that is the limitation of the program. It's most useful where you can actually calculate mass of phosphorus leading a watershed. Concentration is one thing, but a high concentration in a very low flow is not a significant contribution to the downstream lake. So yes, you have to have the pairing of water quantity and quality to get mass, because ultimately it's the mass loading to the lake that matters.
Okay. Well, if you could take us back like 10 years, so right before the network started, what was it about a community-based monitoring network that seemed to make sense at that time as a way to address this issue?
Reality, it was the only way of doing it. It was the only way to get that level of detail. I think the problem with the professional monitoring that was being done, it required well-paid staff, government trucks, driving out to various points in the landscape in an infrequent number of times. It's expensive. So the only way of it's short of having a marvelous array of instruments that you can stick in a stream and forget about it for the year, collect the data in the fall. It's the only way of collecting the detailed information. And it's also probably a huge important part of that is getting people out on the landscape, doing it and talking to people and making them aware of it. So it's cheap advertising to bring a larger population of people who live a long way from Lake Winnipeg, who may have their own local interests for wanting to measure the amount of phosphorus that's coming off of a particular agricultural enterprise, and you know, so it spreads the interest and the understanding of the issue around a greater area of the province than people who live in cottages along the side of the lake.
Sure. And then one final question is, again, taking us back, 10 years or 12 years just before the network started, when you proposed this idea, how was it met in terms of the initial skepticism of, could this work? And then how's that changed over time?
I don't I mean, there's certainly skepticism for the professional agencies using the data, but I don't recall a lot of resistance in terms of trying to mount this kind of program. You had immense amount of help from the conservation districts at the time. The Seine Rat River, of course, the Seine Rat River was a huge area of sport where we had a professional volunteer doing a detailed monitoring program that matched what we were trying to accomplish. So I don't recall a lot of resistance from within the group of community interested in managing phosphorus loading to the lake. But resistance to accepting the concept by professionals, I think. Federal and provincial agencies, and I understand there's still some resistance in accepting the data for making decisions, but.
Okay. Well, thanks, Mike.
Okay.
Okay, and now I think we're going to shift over, and I'm going to ask some questions of Nora. So Nora, Dr. Casson, you got involved when there was already some years existing in the network, so the network had been running for some time, and you used the data in your own research. So for you, what stood out about the data set? Why is it valuable? And what did it enable you to do that you wouldn't have otherwise been able to?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that really stood out to me about the LWF data was the commitment to collecting really high quality data, the commitment to using state-of-the-art lab methods, the commitment to refining protocols as new information arose or new techniques arose. I have some experience with other community-based efforts to collect water quality data, and often because of resource limitations or what different goals of collecting the data, what ends up being collected is not necessarily comparable to what would be collected by government agencies or research labs or things like that. And that's not the case for the community-based monitoring network. It's a really hard thing to do. I always think that collecting the sample is somewhat straightforward. You know, you've got a bottle and you've got a river, and you're gonna take the water from there and take it back to the lab. But there's a large number of considerations to make sure that those data are accurate and reliable. And I've just been really, really impressed with Chelsea and Carl and others at that commitment, and also really happy to kind of contribute to making sure that the data are high quality. The other thing that I'm just constantly struck by is the resolution of the data. It's really high spatial resolution, it's really high temporal resolution. And to speak to the spatial resolution issue, I think if you were in an airplane flying from Toronto to Vancouver, you might think, well, here are the prairies, this all looks the same, we probably need one station here and we'll kind of capture it. But as everyone in the room knows, that's not the reality. There's incredible diversity of all kinds of different things that influence water quality, whether it's what's happening on the landscape, what practices are being used, what the hydrology is like, if the water's being held back, if it's flowing really quickly. The soils are different, the crops are different, the topography is different, all kinds of stuff. And so having this really spatially resolved network where we have lots of stations across the basin is really critical to understanding, both to getting accurate loads, but also to understanding sources of phosphorus across the watershed.
So you just spoke about the importance of the spatial dynamics and in capturing that, and the network does a good job at that. How important is it, do you think, for capturing the sort of event-based sampling? So when there's a storm event or capturing runoff to those annual loads?
Yeah, this is great setup for the other answer I have prepared here, so thanks, Scott. This is an incredible part of the data set to me, how well events are captured, and that's a testament to the efforts of the volunteers both in this room and across the network. Everyone knows it's a lot nicer to go out and take a sample on a sunny day in June when there's no rain and you can drive right up and you're not going to get muddy. It's much more difficult to take that sample on April 10th when it's sleeting and your hands are cold and the roads are in bad shape. And that's not the only reason why monitoring networks tend to have far fewer event samples. They tend to have samples at kind of base flow conditions. But it's one of the reasons why that happens. So first of all, it's very difficult to collect these data, and that is something I am really impressed with. But it's incredibly important, I would say, for two reasons. The first one is this issue of calculating accurate loads, because you're having most of the loading happening during high flow events. If you miss those and you sample before the snow melts and after the snow melts, your number is not going to be correct. But the other reason why it's really important is because it helps us understand why we have high loads. By looking at both the concentration and the flow data together through those events, it helps us understand, is this driven by the flow paths that the water is taking? Is it driven by processes on the landscape that are releasing phosphorus or holding phosphorus back? A lot of the action kind of happens during those high flow events, and so it's really important to capture those. I think it's important to be responsive to the ways in which those events are changing through over time. I was really struck by the graphs that Carl was showing this morning, looking at those big rain events in the summer and the fall, and understanding that if we're starting to see more of those, then that's going to shift how we think about sampling and how we think about when we need to be out there really capturing those events. So I really want to emphasize that there's very few long-term data sets that have this kind of resolution because it's so hard to get, and that again is a real credit to everyone who works on the network.
So both you and Mike have made a point about the importance of both flow and concentration. So when you've looked at this and this data, is there anything that stands out about that relationship? How important is the flow? Is this driven by flow, or is it driven by concentration, or some combination?
So the great answer to that, like all scientists, is it depends. And it varies across the stations, and it varies year to year. At some sites, when you have high flow, you have high phosphorus concentrations, and you can predict the phosphorus concentrations from flow. That's always exciting to scientists because it means then you don't even need to measure the phosphorus, you just measure the flow and model it. But at a lot of sites, that's not the case, and it's not necessarily the case consistently through both snowmelt and rainfall events, and it's not necessarily the case consistently through wet years or dry years, hot years or years with really long winters. So again, without having lots of sites and multiple years of data, you're not able to answer these questions about to what extent is there a relationship between flow and concentration, and to what extent does that relationship not exist, and that becomes really important for making management decisions.
Okay, yeah, I think that is critical because this really depends on what management levers we can employ if our ultimate goal is to reduce the loads to the lake, right?
Yeah. Can I just say one other thing? The one other thing I think that's really valuable about this network and kind of all long-term data networks is it lets you ask and answer questions that weren't the reason why the network was initially set up. And so having an ultimate goal of reducing phosphorus loading to Lake Winnipeg is really great. But the way that the data set has evolved, it also lets us answer other questions about what's going on the landscape, the impact of different weather events or climatic conditions, the impact of management practices. it lets you add stuff on, like the project that Mark's going to talk about this afternoon, and it lets you look back, and because now there's 10 years of data, and it lets you say, oh, was there a question here about the climate that now we think is important that 10 years ago we didn't think was important? So I think that is really exciting about the length of the data set that exists now and the high number of sampling sites.
Okay, thanks, Nora. That's amazing. Okay, we're going to switch over to Dr. Henry Wilson now. So, Henry, you've studied phosphorus runoff from agricultural watersheds and worked with Ag and Ag Food Canada on phosphorus risk maps, which show high phosphorus balances in areas where the network has also identified hotspots. So how does the network data complement the government efforts in phosphorus reduction from agricultural landscapes, and how can this data, this 10 years of data that's been collected, be leveraged by governments for greater impact?
Okay, that's a big question. And maybe a caveat that I'm offering my opinion as a scientist who's interested in these topics, and I'm probably sitting up here because I say yes to things, and and I'm interested and easy to get to talk about stuff, but I made a bunch of notes as there were other speakers this morning. I realized that there's lots of work already ongoing with this data that I'm not necessarily even tied in with. I know that's going on and said, hey, that should happen, and it is happening. And so my colleagues with ECCC, it looks like, are already using some of the data with validation of some of their modeling work, which is great, and I think was kind of, whenever I've had conversations with Chelsea over the years, that's always kind of the hope, to make that connection, or the work for that connection, and for that use to happen, has been put in over the years. And so with the longer term data set and the spatial resolution, you can kind of see some of that happening now, which is great. But like personally, I have done a lot of hey, that's a great idea, and talking to people about it. Haven't necessarily been doing the science myself, so I've got notes that I kind of took along the way, just to where I could see some of that highlighted, and maybe I can give some perspective in terms of why hasn't that already happened in terms of the monitoring or the work that, say, my program or any other federal scientists have been doing. But maybe first I will sort of be a cheerleader for our work and just point out there are pretty obvious interdependencies with federally funded science and monitoring in terms of any of the loading data here is based on Water Survey Canada federal data, and so doing a good job on the hydrology is critical to be doing a good job on the load. And then when it comes to the monitoring, we're a large area with a fairly low population density, and so if we want to get further upstream and into the watershed, we've seen this where there are other activities at a finer scale if we want to cover a large area, and we can see it with why the community-based monitoring works. You need people who are on the ground and close to the sampling locations for it to be efficient. And other than, we prioritize places where there's regulatory reasons or there has been sampling over time to continue to go back and do those. And I think there's a lot of value, and we had a bit of back and forth, I think, in some emails about this too, in terms of the notes and making sure we highlight it. Those sites where we have long-term data are kind of invaluable, and it's really worthwhile to continue to do that, in that we can track those changes over time, over the longer term, back to time periods where farming systems fully have changed, and with climate change, those types of things. And we might not necessarily have the same type of, and this is both federal and provincial data, I think, not always have the same temporal resolution, but having multi-element data can be valuable for answering some of the questions about changes in the stoichiometry of what's moving downstream. And also if we don't necessarily have the same resolution, if we have a lot of years of data under different conditions, we can still start to look at some of those relationships with flow, with time, with season, and kind of fill in some of the gaps with some of our modeling or statistical work. But having this finer spatial resolution data, at least on the phosphorus side, then it's creating a lot of opportunities. We're starting to see, I don't know if we say bear fruit or whatever, in terms of the kind of collaborations with academia that you have, and with other federal colleagues in terms of being able to target some questions in terms of like validating the models that we maybe have developed with the longer term data. Then we have a independent or separate data sets that were created separately, independently from each other, which is really useful for validation. Instead of maybe we could normally would remove some data from a data set and then see how our model performs. We've got a completely independent data set to start to do some of those comparisons. We can start to maybe make, Nora mentioned some of this already, better statistical models when we're trying to predict load. And there's questions we can ask too, and we have higher frequency data, and I've done some of this just for my program with data that we've collected. We do it maybe more in a targeted way, like we're picking sites for certain why questions, but you can say, okay, well, what would be the impact on the accuracy of our load calculation if we removed certain data points from the sampling? Do we have to go out as frequently? And so when you have a higher resolution data set like this, then you can do those types of exercises, and there's some things that are useful there just in terms of practical uses, and probably both informing your own sampling and that of others, maybe how to do that efficiently. And there's lots of opportunity, I think, to increase the type of collaboration that we're talking about. We're adding some new, or you're going to be adding some new work with the TFA stuff, but probably in terms of other nutrients, questions like that. As people know more about this, and the value of the network kind of comes to be more well known, or it already is now, right? Those kind of opportunities are there, I think, and as I'm seeing and listening, there's interesting questions in terms of, okay, well, what is going on with nitrogen? What's happening in system? That kind of thing. I have some other notes that I'll maybe just leave if we're kind of talking about sort of future and that side of things. But I think there are some connections to be made along those lines, and thinking about, I see that spatial coverage throughout the watershed. And we are focused on Lake Winnipeg, right, in terms of sort of like the title and what's going on. But there are a lot of aquatic systems within the watershed, and how we interpret that data and the implications for those, it might be a little bit different. There might be trade-offs. There's some questions, around residence time and what loading means in stream versus downstream that having a network like this starts to answer. And I think probably with it being community-based, some of the people sampling probably are interested in those kind of questions, or interested in their local systems. And so that's, I don't want to say something not to lose sight of, but it's like there's an opportunity there as well, I think, because those stream systems themselves kind of, there's going to be different management considerations.
Right. So you've been speaking a bit about this, and reflecting back to earlier this morning, so Carl was showing us the data from the last several years from the monitoring network, and then both yourself and Chelsea brought up the watershed models that are being used. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how important are these models to regulators? Is this the primary mechanism that they use to understand things like phosphorus loading to the lake, or in our case? And then how do you see these two things linking together? And I think you've touched on this already, but the importance of linking those models to the real data.
I don't know. I guess just in terms of, as a research scientist, maybe spin this a little bit. I'm not that connected in terms of the policy, the regulation side, but they are being used, and this was highlighted by Chelsea, to think about targeting limited resources and where we make those efforts. And so I think both with monitoring in general, whether it's the network or federal or provincial, we tend to be better at defining the problem than defining the solutions. And so this kind of gets into where I have some of the notes. I think that's something for us to keep in mind when we have finer spatial resolution data. We get closer to the source, and maybe if we are monitoring in the right places and are implementing changes on the landscape, we might see change. We might be able to detect a change more quickly than we would be further downstream. But we're just sort of defining, say, where the hotspot is, where the problem is. So you get to the solution, we maybe need to go another step finer in terms of where we're working. And so there's kind of some work to do with that, and we'll be able to define some of the why questions, some hypotheses, even when we're making correlation with land use or data that we'll have at that scale. But if we want to know about management practices and implications sort of changes or ideas that we might have, or our partners on the ground may have in terms of solutions, we need to go another step into a finer scale. And I think there is a role. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that I do and my colleagues do, sort of for targeted work in that case. And that's the kind of thing that federal research is doing and academic research is doing, where we can take some of what we're doing at this scale, sort of defining some, I guess, hypotheses about why we might see some of the patterns we do, but then we have to answer those questions about why to get to solutions, some ideas about management practices that might be implemented, and do some of the finer scale work with that, and more targeted sort of research around that. So I don't know, it's kind of like a non-answer, but also kind of my take on where I would go with it.
I think Mike has a point here too.
Yeah.
I have a question. I mean, at what point does at what point does spatial and temporal detail of monitoring just make modeling redundant? You don't need to model it, you're measuring it.
Who's this? Is it?
I have a thought on that one, but yeah, right. Well, I mean, it's sort of there's the cost involved in long term or not with it, but I guess one of the things with the model, particularly if it's biophysical, is that there are assumptions or hypotheses about the system built into that, about how it functions and sort of the why side. So we can use the models for prediction, which is kind of the piece that you're getting with. But I think you can also use models to describe the system and ask why we might see a pattern. So there's still a place.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, so maybe to follow up on that question that Mike asked, where do you think the models are at right now in terms of how well they predict the implementation of best management practices in reducing phosphorus loads?
I guess they're about as it depends on where our science is at with our understanding of the best management practice. So I think my colleagues that do modeling are always trying to sort of add new knowledge or adapt sort of the models to reflect that. And so it kind of depends on both what data is available in terms of input, and so some of that might be where a limitation is, and and then there is some of the understanding, describing the system, being able to even kind of predict it. So I don't know. It's a balance usually.
Because it would seem to me that there's additional value in the network data, the real data, that's being collected that could test the model predictions about those and improve them over time. Like you're saying that sometimes the model, the ability of the model to predict the outcome of a implementation of a best management practice depends on the data that goes into it. And so the network is providing some of that data, but also is able to monitor the outcome after that best management practice has been implemented, right?
Yeah, it's closer. It's at a finer scale. You're closer to the scale or the source that you might be able to do that. But it's also dependent on whether we have the quality of kind of description of the system or the input data to be able to have a model that gets to the level of describing management and management change. Some of them may be pretty correlative, or like if it's coarse and we're saying, is there agriculture or no agriculture, or like the proportion of agriculture in a watershed, it's pretty hard to take that to a level where we're talking about management or management change. Yeah.
Mike, did you have a comment?
Could you see a point when the modeling is so good that we don't have to do the detailed measuring? Like they're coming at it from opposite ends, but
Yeah.
if you measure incredibly frequently, spatially, temporally, it's the reality. If you've got a really good model, you don't need to. So can you see a point when the modeling will preclude detailed actual monitoring in real time?
Yeah, please.
Sorry, take Henry off the hot seat. The question about reducing phosphorus loading to streams and lakes is incredibly complicated and requires people to be thinking at all kinds of different scales. And so I think part of the question about when is it worth investing in modeling, and when is it worth investing in monitoring, and when is it worth investing in the type of work that Henry does, which is looking at what's happening at a field scale, depends on the question that you're asking and the answer that you're looking for. None of those scales are going to answer all of the questions. The modeling will do a really good job of identifying long-term changes, because you can run models for hundreds of years. The computers don't care. The monitoring does a really good job of targeting things at a sub-watershed level. And then there's also a need for kind of detailed process-based studies, especially when we're talking about evaluating what is working and what is not working. So I think these are not questions that Henry's going to answer by himself or Scott's going to answer by himself. They're questions that we need people at all different levels of kind of scale of thinking, as well as different types of organizations to be thinking about.
Okay, thanks, Nora. Okay, I think we're going to have some questions where we're going to open this up to the whole panel now. And the first one is, so the monitoring network has now been running for 10 years. What do you feel is the greatest accomplishment that the network has been able to do over that 10 years? I don't know whoever would like to start or address it. Mike, you've been around since the start.
The greatest accomplishment. Well, I mean the greatest. I think the data is important and highly valuable, and what the program was about acquiring. But I think the greatest accomplishment is demonstrating the power of this type of organization, whether it's measuring phosphorus or counting frogs. It's the fact that you have an organized network of passionate people out there in the landscape. You've given them the tools to let amateurs do things that we used to have to pay professionals to do. You've given them the tools of feedback to show what it is they're grabbing a water sample ultimately means in terms of the numbers, the integration of the numbers, and how it's being used by agencies that we pay taxes to support to use that data and make better management decisions in the watershed. So it's the model of the engine that you've built, and yeah, whether you're collecting phosphorus data or any other parameter, it's the organization that you've developed, and hopefully it will be a model for extending this concept across a lot more watersheds.
Wondering if either of you have any comments on, for you, what you think the successes have been the biggest.
Sure. I think I don't know if this is the biggest success. Chelsea's flashing time. But just to say, we live in a time where financial resources are limited. I think we're always going to live in that time. And so thinking about alternative ways of collecting data and understanding watershed processes is really powerful. And the type of resources that the community-based monitoring network uses, some of them are financial for sure. There's a large cost to it, but it's mobilizing people who live in the area who care about it. And so that's really exciting to me, that something like this could be complementary to other monitoring efforts.
Yeah, I agree. I think, for me, and I'll say this is, very high level, but, I'm a lake scientist and, really care about the issues of eutrophication. But one of the big things that I've learned in being part of this is that many of the solutions are not in the lake. The solutions are in the landscape. And it takes the level of data and information that this network is generating over now 10 years to be able to get to the solutions, because I think as these issues were raised in the past, there wasn't that data there in order to address the problems where they are. And so I'm really hopeful that there's 10 years in now, and like I think, Nora, you mentioned before, the large spatial amount of data that's collected now, high resolution over 10 years, is now getting us closer to the place where the hotspots are identified, where potential solutions are identified, and to a place where we may even be able to test the success or failure of best management practices when they're implemented. So that's maybe a long-winded answer, but I'm just really think of this network as just a huge success and a huge way forward for the health of Lake Winnipeg. So for me, that it's a pretty big picture accomplishment. On the challenge side, I wonder if anyone might comment. What are the biggest challenges that still face the network?
It's like any small business that's all of a sudden highly successful. It's scaling. I mean, the reason why there was a gap in analyzing the samples, it was just overwhelmed with the growth in the number of volunteers, and to the point where manual analytical techniques just couldn't keep up with the samples. So it's scaling. You start out as a fabulous idea. It's working really well. You get big, and some of the supporting infrastructure to allow the scaling is sometimes missing. So I think that was the biggest problem. It's not whether or not it was a great project. It was just trying to keep up with your own success.
Okay, then maybe I will ask one more question before we go to the audience. And that is, what do you think is the most important questions that you think the monitoring network and the data that it provides can help answer in the upcoming decade?
Sure. If you it's incredible that the monitoring network has been running for a decade. Sometimes when I'm thinking about this, I take my age and I add 10 years to it, and I think that's where we're going to be in 10 years. Yikes! And one of the things I always think is the challenges that are coming in the next 10 years. We don't fully know. Some of them we can predict, right? We know that we live in a changing climate, and the climate in our region is going to change. There are going to be changes on the landscape, changes to management and regulatory environments. And so having a consistent way of looking at the phosphorus concentrations in streams across the region that proceeds in the face of these challenges, I think is really important and will let us address these questions that we don't even know exist at this point.
Okay.
That's a good answer. I guess I maybe just expand on that. If we are optimistic and think that in the near future there may be some changes happening on the landscape, then we're well set up to characterize the improvement in water quality that we'll see over time too.
I think arguably, one of the most important questions that the network could answer is probably questions that are going to be asked by other people than the Lake Winnipeg Foundation. There's other academics, people who have questions about processes going on in the landscape that don't have a network of grad students that can go out and totally cover the province in collecting data. So, I'm sure this network will continue to do a great job of why it was created, but I have to try to lobby to have this concept of citizen science that's been beautifully demonstrated in this monitoring network, to have that concept expanded. I mean, it would be really nice if the Canada Water Agency had an identified funding stream that promoted the collection of citizen science data, because there's a lot more watersheds in the country than southern Manitoba, and they all have their own problems and their own interests, and could benefit from the kind of model that the Foundation's monitoring program has demonstrated. So they're a highly credible group that I hope they managed to promote a much broader application of this approach to give the scientific community a level of detailed information on a whole bunch of issues, whether maybe it's nitrogen, maybe it's salinity, I don't know what it is, but it's the power of the network that I am most enthused about.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Okay, and now I think we're going to open up the floor to questions from any of you. So you've got some experts up here on lake water quality and on watersheds. What questions do you have for you?
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Hamanishi. I'm one of your volunteers. My question has to do with, have you looked at the correlation between soil type and the runoff data? So, in my area it's very sandy, whereas in around Winnipeg it's very clay-based. So how does that change things?
Okay. Off. Can you hear me? It's coming through, sorry. Okay, great news is there's a whole presentation coming up on that this afternoon. Darshi Kumaragamage, who's at the University of Winnipeg, is leading a CWA-funded project that Henry and I and a number of others in the room are also contributing to. And that's one of the important questions that project is going to answer. How does soil type and how it varies across the region predict or interact with the patterns of phosphorus that we see? The other thing that project is going to answer, not to steal Darshi's thunder for this afternoon, is to say, okay, we've got lots of information about soils across the province, lots of great maps. We've got great community-based monitoring data. We know a lot of it comes in the snow, but we don't know a lot about what's happening with the snow, how the phosphorus is being picked up during the snow melt, how that's interacting with the soil and leading to the stream. So I think that's a really kind of fundamental question, especially when we think about what recommendations can we make to people living in different areas.
And I guess at a sort of a field scale, there is quite a bit that we know about that. At least a lot of our agricultural soils tend to be clay loam soils. So there's sometimes a correlation between like land use and soil type, just based on what suitability is there. So the soil characteristics will somewhat define sort of what goes on with the hydrology and where water flows, but for those soils that tend to be more suitable for cropping, for agriculture, when we've looked across a bunch of different locations in Manitoba, we do see a pretty strong relationship between soil test phosphorus and potential for loss of phosphorus with snowmelt runoff or with runoff, kind of regardless of crop type. And that side of things. So that's the great news with that, is that that's something that's measurable, that it's predictable. Any change that we make there with management has an impact. And so then it's really just a question of where do we have too much of a good thing or not, and it's something that we can manage well with sort of the 4 R's of phosphorus management, and there's different techniques, different strategies. And maybe even different mitigating measures, like some of what Darshi will talk about. But that's something that we do have a pretty good handle on, and some data around.
Hi, John Chalice from Ag Canada. I'm from Winnipeg, but I've lived away from Manitoba for 10 years. So coming back, it's interesting to be back involved in Lake Winnipeg. But the problem and the scale of the problem around Lake Winnipeg has always just seemed so intractable to me that, the scale across provinces, across national borders, the competing interests, and more on a local level, thinking about getting adoption of best management practices. So just big picture, I guess, question, like I pick the time scale, maybe 10 years or 20 years. If you were to see, in the next 10 or 20 years, a great improvement in Lake Winnipeg water quality, what are some of the specific things that would have had to have happened in the watershed to have seen those improvements? What needs to happen?
That's a great question. First off, does anyone here want to jump in? Okay, well, maybe I'll start with a big picture answer. And I'm not one thing is, for me, the recognition that the loads, phosphorus loads to Lake Winnipeg, and one of the main reasons why we have the large algal blooms in Lake Winnipeg is non-point source loads, right? So there's the contribution of point sources like the sewage treatment plants in Winnipeg and others, but those represent, you know, a small fraction of the total loads to Lake Winnipeg. And the other thing that has stood out to me in looking at the data over the years is the role of climate change in this. And in the early 1990s, there was a really large increase in precipitation, basically a whole step change in the amount of annual precipitation that we get in the province, especially, or in the Red River Basin anyways. And that really increased the amount of phosphorus loading to the lake. It's still incredibly variable from year to year. But to me, what that means is that the loads to Lake Winnipeg are now even more sensitive to land use than they were prior to that period. And so success is going to mean having to address that face on and dealing with these issues in this new scenario of higher precipitation sort of moving forward. Because at least the predictions that I've seen and projections seen going forward is that for this part of the country, that this same level of precipitation is expected in the upcoming decades. Yeah. So I'll see if
I think that one of the things that will have to happen or will facilitate success is a greater cooperative relationship with the province. I'm perhaps a bit out of touch with how things stood, but there are a large number of point source lagoons in the province where there is loading data available for. I don't know how readily that data has not been traditionally available. In terms of looking at hotspots, municipal lagoons, and there are probably 50 or 60 significant ones in the province. That is not a data set that's incorporated into understanding hotspots. And so every manure, we have a great deal of detail in terms of sampling points. Well, every manure management point in the province has got budget data available for it. It has quantity of manure and concentration in the manure. So there's a lot more data that's available that unless things have changed drastically recently, is just not available for us to lay over top of the detailed monitoring network when we're identifying hotspots. So a greater cooperation between the efforts of the foundation and the province would be, I think, a thing that's going to have to happen to achieve success in better managing the watershed for its nutrient yields.
I think if we see success, we're going to see it upstream first. So we're working at a little bit finer scale and having some examples of success maybe is the success that we're going to see on a 10-year time step, and knowing if I'm kind of getting the question right, and knowing what's going to work and having some acceptance of that. That's probably the first success that we target, because there's a legacy within the systems that is going to probably mask any progress that we're making as we are moving further downstream. And climate change might amplify some of the interaction with non-point source. It's also in some ways causal as well, and is not something that we're going to be able to address within 10 years. So if we have more extremes and increase in loading that's more tied to climate change than it is to land use in some cases, that's also kind of going to limit what kind of impact. I'm not mean to be doom and gloom or whatever, but what impact we see first downstream. So what we can control is further upstream, and so if we have some of those examples of success and are working at the right scales to illustrate that, then that's something that we can build on. And there are, I think, some positives there and some examples of what we know that works, so making those links will be really important.
Okay, thank you. And I think this is going to wrap up our panel discussion. I hope you can join me in thanking our panelists for joining us today and answering a whole suite of questions on Lake Winnipeg and its basin. So thank you very much.